Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that I think is on a lot of our minds. How to keep our brains sharp as we age.
Absolutely. It's a question we all face. And the good news is you've provided us with a ton of research about what we can do without relying on medications to keep our cognitive function strong as we get older.
Yeah, the listener sent us a really thorough review of studies published between 2000 and 2016. They really dug deep into multiple research databases like Web of Science, Scopus, Medline, and Springer.
Wow, that's a comprehensive approach to finding out what really works.
It is. And what's cool is this review specifically looked at non-pharmacological lifestyle strategies, which means things we can do in our everyday lives. Changes we can make to our habits and routines.
Right, things we have more control over. So in this deep dive, our mission is to sort through all this research and pull out the most promising and practical advice for the listener.
Perfect. And the review helpfully grouped these strategies into three main categories: physical activities, a healthy diet focusing on the Mediterranean diet, and cognitive training.
That's a great roadmap. Where should we start?
Let's jump into physical activity first. I think a lot of us intuitively know that exercise is good for us, but what does the research actually say about its effects on cognitive aging?
Well, one thing that comes up consistently across a number of studies is that more overall physical activity, just moving more in general, seems to be associated with a lower risk of cognitive decline.
So it's not just about hitting the gym a few times a week.
Right. Like there's this 2012 study by Buchman and his colleagues where they followed a large group of older adults for a while. It was an observational study, which means they just observed their habits and tracked what happened over time.
Got it.
And they found that the people who just generally moved more throughout the day were less likely to experience cognitive decline compared to those who were less active. It wasn't about structured exercise so much as just being more active overall.
So it's about making movement a regular part of our lives.
It seems that way, like taking the stairs instead of the elevator, walking or biking instead of driving short distances, things like that.
That makes sense. Now, what about the intensity of exercise? Does pushing ourselves harder make a bigger difference?
That's a great question. A study by Larson and his team in 2006 suggests that exercising at a moderate intensity at least 3 times a week could actually reduce the risk of developing dementia.
Oh, wow. That's pretty significant.
It is. And this brings up a really important point that was also highlighted in the review. Sometimes longer studies show us things that shorter studies miss. There was a 15-year study by Sorman and colleagues back in 2014.
15 years, that's a long time to track people.
Exactly. And what they found was that while there seemed to be clear benefits of physical activity in the short term, like within a few years, the evidence for long-term prevention of cognitive decline wasn't as strong.
That's interesting. So are we saying exercise isn't as effective in the long run?
Not necessarily. The review also cited another paper that suggested the benefits of physical activity might be small, individually, but accumulate over many years, like a slow and steady approach, which is harder to detect in shorter studies.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture. It's like those small benefits from every workout and every active choice we make add up over time.
Exactly. And it might be that those benefits are just harder to see over a shorter period.
It makes sense. So it's not just about quick fixes, it's about consistent effort over the long haul.
Right. And it's not just about moving more in general either. The review also looked at specific types of exercise and their impact on different brain functions.
Let's dive into that. Aerobic exercise seemed to get a lot of attention. Why is that so important for our brains?
Well, there's this amazing study from 2006 by Colcomb and colleagues where they actually looked at the brains of older adults using MRI scans before and after an aerobic exercise training program.
So they could see how exercise literally changed their brains.
Yeah. And what they found was that aerobic exercise led to an increase in brain volume in key areas like the prefrontal and temporal cortices.
And remind us what those parts of the brain do.
Well, those are the areas that are crucial for things like planning, decision-making, memory, and even language. They're like the control centers of our higher-level thinking skills.
So exercise can actually help maintain or even grow those crucial brain areas.
That's what this study suggests. And it's not just about overall brain volume either. Another study by Erickson and colleagues in 2009 found a link between aerobic fitness and the size of the hippocampus, which is that seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain that's super important for forming new memories.
I remember learning about that in school.
Right. And what they found was that people with higher levels of aerobic fitness tended to have larger hippocampia, and this was also linked to better performance on spatial memory tasks, like remembering where things are or navigating through spaces.
So it's not just about overall brain health, but also about supporting specific brain regions that are essential for cognitive function.
Precisely. Now, there's another study that I think is super interesting because it looked at water-based exercise and even compared two different approaches to working out in water.
Water exercise. Okay, tell us more about that.
So in this 2015 study by Sato and his team, they had two groups of older adults. One group did a water-based exercise program that they called Norway, which mainly focused on walking, strength training, stepping exercises, and stretching in the water.
Okay, sounds like a pretty typical water aerobics class.
Right. Then the other group did what they called Cogwe, which combined similar water-based movements with specific cognitive exercises they did while in the water.
So they were challenging their brains and their bodies at the same time.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that while Norway mostly improved physical abilities like walking speed and lower limb strength, which is great, the Cogwe program led to some pretty remarkable improvements in things like attention, memory, learning, and overall cognitive function.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it seems like adding those cognitive challenges to the physical workout made a big difference.
That's what the study suggests. It highlights the potential of personalized exercise programs that are tailored to target both physical and cognitive needs simultaneously.
So it's not just about moving your body, but also about engaging your mind at the same time.
Absolutely. And it's not limited to just those types of exercise either. The review even talked about learning a musical instrument, specifically piano instruction.
Oh, that's intriguing. So learning to play the piano can help with cognitive aging.
Well, a study by Bugos and his team in 2007 looked at older adults with no prior musical experience and gave them individualized piano lessons. They had a 30-minute lesson every week and were asked to practice for at least 3 hours a week over 9 months.
9 months? That's a pretty serious commitment.
It is. But the findings were really promising. They suggested that this kind of piano instruction could improve things like executive function, which includes planning, problem solving, and decision making, as well as working memory, which is our ability to hold information in mind and use it.
So it's not just about the piano itself, right? It's more about the cognitive challenge of learning a new and complex skill.
Exactly. And, there's another study that looked at something that seems pretty basic, walking. But it was about how our brains handle walking while doing another task at the same time.
Okay, walking and multitasking. How did they study that?
This was a 2013 study by Simoni and his colleagues, and they had people do a cognitive task while walking, either on a treadmill or just walking freely over ground.
So like walking and talking or walking and doing mental math.
Yeah, something like that. And they found that when people walked over ground while doing the cognitive task, both their walking performance and their performance on the cognitive task declined.
So multitasking while walking wasn't so great for either task.
Right. But here's the interesting part. When they walked on the treadmill while doing the same task, their performance on the thinking task didn't seem to be affected as much.
Huh, that's surprising. Why would that be?
The researchers think it might have something to do with the different brain areas involved in each type of walking. Like, treadmill walking is more consistent and predictable, so it might not demand as much attention and cognitive resources as walking over ground, which requires more adjustments and attention to the environment.
So it's almost like the treadmill freed up more brain power to focus on the cognitive task.
That's one possible explanation. It really shows how complex our brain is and how it prioritizes different tasks depending on what we're doing.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with physical activity. Let's move on to the next big area, diet. You mentioned earlier that the Mediterranean diet, or Mediet as it's often called, is a focus here. We always hear good things about it, but what did this research review specifically say about its impact on cognitive function?
Well, the review strongly supports what we've been hearing about the Mediet, especially when it's rich in olive oil and nuts. They seem to be key components.
So not just any Mediet, but one that emphasizes those two things.
It seems that way. There's a pretty landmark study from 2013 by Martinez Lapacina and colleagues. It was a clinical trial, which means they randomly assigned people to different diet groups and followed them for over 6 years.
6 years, that's impressive for a diet study.
Right. And they found that the people who followed a Mediet, particularly one supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, had better overall cognitive performance at the end of the study, with significant improvements in verbal fluency and memory.
So it really seems like sticking to that way of eating can make a difference.
And another 5-year study, this one by Valls Pedret and colleagues in 2015, found that a Mediet supplemented with either olive oil or nuts was associated with better cognitive function in healthy older adults.
Okay, so two solid long-term studies showing benefits.
Exactly. And it seems that this specific combination of foods in the diet might be what makes it so effective. All the antioxidants from fruits and vegetables, the healthy fats from olive oil and nuts, the omega-3 fatty acids from fish.
It's about the whole package, not just one or two ingredients.
Exactly. And it's really encouraging to see that a way of eating that's also delicious and enjoyable can have such a positive impact on our brain health.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the last category, cognitive training. What kinds of brain exercises did the research highlight as being beneficial?
Well, one activity that came up a lot was solving crossword puzzles. It sounds simple, but there's some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that it can help maintain cognitive function.
Like just your typical newspaper crossword puzzle.
Yep. There's this study by Murphy and colleagues from 2014 where they had older adults do crossword puzzles daily for just 4 weeks. And even that short intervention led to improvements in what's called phonemic verbal fluency.
Okay, break that down for us. What exactly is phonemic verbal fluency?
It's basically our ability to quickly come up with words that start with a certain letter. It's a measure of cognitive flexibility and how well we can access and retrieve information from our memory.
And the crossword puzzles helped with that.
It seems so. And even earlier research, like a study by Verghese and colleagues in 2003, suggested that people who solved crosswords 4 times a week had a 47% lower risk of developing dementia compared to those who only did them once a week.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference. And this is all just from doing crossword puzzles.
Pretty amazing,
That's
Brad.
true.
The review also mentioned some interesting research on music therapy. Specifically, there was a study looking at the effects of listening to Buddhist hymns.
Buddhist hymns, that's very specific.
It is. But in this 2015 study by Tai and colleagues, they had healthy older adults listen to 30-minute recordings of Buddhist hymns twice a day, 5 days a week, for 4 months.
4 months of daily listening. Okay.
Yeah. And what they found was that the group who listened to the hymns had less decline in their scores on the Mini Mental State Examination, or MMSE, which is a commonly used test to assess overall cognitive function.
So the hymns seem to have a protective effect on their cognitive abilities.
It seems so. And they also found that the hymn listening group showed improvements in mood, so there might be emotional benefits as well.
So it's not just about thinking, it's about feeling good too.
Right, it's all connected. And the review also briefly touched on the potential of educational programs for supporting cognitive health in older adults.
Like going back to school.
Well, not necessarily formal schooling, but there was a study by Miller and colleagues in 2012 where they had older adults participate in a 6-week program that included memory training, physical activity, stress reduction techniques, and dietary advice.
So it was a multifaceted program hitting several areas at once.
Exactly. And even though this study didn't have a control group to compare to, they still found that the participants got better at learning and remembering new information, and they also reported feeling more confident about their memory abilities.
So taking a holistic approach that addresses multiple lifestyle factors seems promising.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important point that the review emphasized. The idea that the most effective interventions might be those that combine several of these activities done regularly.
So it's not about finding one magic bullet, but about incorporating multiple beneficial habits into our lives.
Exactly. And ideally, starting these habits in midlife, not waiting until we're already experiencing cognitive decline.
That makes sense. Start early, build healthy habits, and keep them going.
Right. Now, it's important to acknowledge that the review did point out some limitations in the research itself.
Okay, what were some of the things to keep in mind?
Well, in some areas, there's a lack of what are considered the gold standard studies, which are long-term randomized controlled trials.
Because those are the studies that can give us the most confident results.
Exactly. And they also noted that the studies in the review used a variety of methods, with some having control groups that didn't receive any intervention, and some not having control groups at all. Plus, some studies had relatively small sample sizes.
So it's not that the findings are wrong, but more that we need more research to confirm and strengthen the evidence.
That's a good way to put it. It's an evolving area of research, and there's always more to learn.
Right. But even with those limitations, the review did highlight some really positive takeaways about these non-pharmacological approaches.
Definitely. For one thing, these lifestyle changes are generally much less expensive and less invasive than medical treatments. And importantly, many of them can also provide opportunities for social interaction, which we know is so crucial for overall well-being. especially as we age.
So it's about more than just cognitive function. It's about quality of life.
Exactly.
So to bring it all together for our listeners, this deep dive into the research paints a pretty optimistic picture, right?
I think so. It's not all about decline. There are things we can do to support our cognitive health as we age.
We're not just passive bystanders. We have agency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The evidence suggests that making physical activity a regular part of your life, and remember, that could be anything from brisk walking to dancing to swimming to learning to play tennis.
And what about the specifics for brain health? We talked about those.
Right, right. When it comes to your brain, try adding in those cognitive challenges, like the Cogwee water exercises we discussed, and hey, maybe even try picking up a new instrument.
And of course, there's that Mediterranean diet.
Yes. Fill your plate with colorful fruits and vegetables, heart-healthy olive oil and nuts, and enjoy delicious meals that are good for your body and your mind.
And don't forget those crossword puzzles.
Absolutely. Challenge yourself with brain games, puzzles, and learning new things, whatever sparks your interest.
The key takeaways here seem to be consistency, choosing activities you enjoy so you'll stick with them, and maybe even combining different approaches for a well-rounded approach.
And here's a thought for our listener. Think about what resonated most with you today. What are one or two of these strategies that you could realistically incorporate into your life starting today?
That's a great question for everyone to ponder. It's about finding what works for you and making it a sustainable part of your routine.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for bringing us this research and joining us for this deep dive into the world of cognitive aging. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've all gained some valuable insights today. Until next time, keep those brains sharp and keep exploring.